if you were looking at it on a very general level, it's generally quite positive, because most of the studies have a positive effect. But it just speaks to the fact that you need to be very specific about what it is you're trying to address. Because, so that would be an example of a very specific case where the tool is right for the job. We don't know if there's a reason behind this, but they said, probably more studies are needed. But it does put those interventions who are app-based or mobile-based at an advantage. Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, Stuart and I explore a paper which outlines the results of a meta-analysis conducted into the use of digital mathematical interventions. Stuart, it's great to see you. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you, Kieran. It's good to be back. How are you getting on?
Yeah, not too bad. I mean, I'm not snowed in here. A little bit of snow yesterday afternoon, but you've been knee deep in snow as far as I'm aware. Is that right?
Well, that's right. Very exciting up in the northeast of Scotland. Almost everything is ground to a halt. We've got about 30 to 40 sort of centimetres of snow here. So snow day for me, which, when I was at school was an exciting time. But of course, now with all our online learning and Teams platforms and all the rest, then the kids have got plenty of work to keep them busy. Although for me, I think they should go out and build an igloo.
Yeah, two rights. I mean, the pandemic put paid to the snow day as we know it, or loved it, So, I mean, you've moved from the southernmost point of Spain to pretty much the most northerly part of Scotland that's inhabited. Certainly the Romans wouldn't have made it as far as you live. And this snow is probably the only upside to that move, isn't it?
Well, even the novelty of the snow, I think, is well and truly worn off, to be honest. It was a wonderful experience living a stone's throw from the north of Africa. So obviously it's a bit of a transition moving up to the north of Scotland, but it's great to be here. It's great to be back in Scotland and working with some of the local kids as well.
Yeah, for better or worse. So I've been diving into a meta-analysis that was released, I think it was published around maybe the summer of 2025, but only really made it into the world by about November. I've got November 25 on my paper. And it's called A Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis of Digital Mathematics Interventions for K-12 Students with Mathematical Learning Disabilities. And that's Alam, Gao, and Dubé. And I think this is really interesting because the selection of papers covers the years 2000 to 2023, I think. So it's a pretty comprehensive study of the research into sort of the use of digital interventions, particularly those students with difficulties or disabilities. And so I thought if we almost switch roles and you can sort of grill me on this and on my understanding of this, because I think it's a really important topic. And also, this episode went on Wednesday. We're sort of playing with the format. To that base was 5 years old there at the start of the year. So we're playing with the format, see what's possible. And, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts recently, and there's a lot less structure sometimes. Like Louis Theroux will have his guests walking in. Obviously, we don't have the luxury of the Spotify studios, but they have the guests walking in as the opening, and they're having a chat or whatever. And then some people just start talking and don't do an intro and stuff. So I'm playing with the format. And really going into these research papers, on a Wednesday might be something that we do more regularly. When I told you the title of the paper, Stuart, what sort of questions came to mind?
Well, first of all, I think it's worth saying happy 5th birthday. I think it's incredible that TDAPI's been going on for so long. I can't imagine how many teachers have been affected by the conversations that you've had with so many wonderful guests. So it's great to be back.
Affected by means it sounds like there's a helpline. If you've been affected by TDAPI, call this
number. Yeah, call us now. There's help on hand. Well, when you talked about the title of the paper, it's probably not a catchy title, but then again, with these research papers, whenever is the title super catchy? But I was wondering, because you're the sort of expert here at the moment, having gone through that paper, when teachers hear that kind of phrase, digital maths interventions for students with maths learning difficulties, I mean, what was the promise that's being sold here, and what's the risk if we sort of buy into an intervention uncritically?
Obviously, the initial well, there are two that really strike me as a teacher. The first is the expense. Now, as a maths lead, I was a particularly thrifty. Is thrifty the right word? We you don't like to spend too much money on intervention or on outside resources.
Thrifty, I think, is the word. Yes, not rifty, which is a different thing.
I hope you haven't got. Don't lose my non-explicit tag by making. I don't know what that means. So if Spotify's listening, I don't know what he's talking about. And yeah, so like I was very keen to count every penny, and so I think if we're spending money, sometimes these interventions come at quite huge costs, relative to the overall budget that just you might have in school. And then also there's the fact that pupil time is an expense, teacher time is an expense, and we especially with pupils who have got disabilities or difficulties in an area, they have less time than everyone else to spend, and less time to waste. And so the risk when we're being sold a dream is that it's going to be a waste of money, but probably even worse, a waste of time, because we can always get that money back in some way in the future because we don't just stop spending it. But that pupil who will have gone through that 6 months or whatever only gets that once, don't they?
That makes perfect sense, I think, and it's transferable across all sorts of interventions, isn't it? Really, because we do have a finite budget and a finite amount of time. So, what is the problem that we have? What are the solutions that are available, and what is what's the approach that's going to give us the highest chance of success, basically? So this is not just one single sort of study, is it? This is one of these sort of meta-analysis things. So, I'm not 100% sure what that is. If you had to explain a systematic review and meta-analysis to a busy teacher, and you've got 20 seconds, what would you say to them?
The best way I can describe it is that the researchers will outline their criteria for what an effective paper in a particular field looks like, and then they will try to collect all of those papers, and then they will compare the reported effect sizes or the reported impact of a given thing. And so in this instance, they took all the papers published between, I think, January 2000 and May 2023 that were researching some form of digital math intervention. So they would define what a digital math intervention was. They would define their view of learning and disability, and then they would find relevant papers. Now, the interesting thing is that across those 23 years, they only found 24 papers that they found were robust enough to put into their meta analysis. And so I think I had an episode with John from the Education Endowment Foundation quite a while ago now, but he talked about how their analysis team will explore the relevant research when they're making their reports and things. And so it's a lot like that. Where's the relevant research? Do they meet our standards in terms of being robust, being replicable, and then looking at them together instead of having one specific instance? You have a broad set that you can hopefully generalize against.
Again, I think that makes perfect sense to do that, doesn't it? As long as the criteria or the bar is high enough for accepting different reviews and studies in, then this meta-analysis sounds like it could be a sort of promising way forward. Now, there's two things you mentioned there. You talked about them sort of making some definitions. But one thing I was interested in here is, when we're talking about digital maths interventions, what are we actually talking about here? Are we talking about an app or some sort of game or some sort of computer assisted instruction, or is it something else?
It was actually quite broad. So yeah, apps and games, maths apps and games, is sort of the sort of the layman's terminology for. So any sort of digital maths intervention. But the studies included, things that were computer programmed maths tasks. So you had e-books or e-word books, maths activities, computer assisted instruction, and just general maths game apps as well. So anything that was delivered as a computer based or mobile based, and that's actually quite important in the findings. Um, using those tools, anything that can be delivered using those tools would count. And part of that might have been because they were struggling to find, or I don't know if they extended it, but they probably needed to be broad because they probably would have had fewer if it was just, for instance, the maths interventions where it was taught by the computer at the same time.
That is really interesting then, and I think we might dive into your comment there about mobile and its importance or its implications further on in this conversation. But something that I also wanted to understand here as we're sort of talking about definitions is what is it that counts as a maths learning difficulty or maths learning disability, I think was the phrase in this review, and how consistent is that sort of definition across all of those studies that were included?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably one of those areas that could have a bit of pushback. I think, if I were looking at this, you know, a maths learning disability was, in general terms, a child performing below a given population percentile rank on a standardized maths test. So those pupils who were performing significantly below their peers, relative to their peers, when in examinations or in standardized tests. And I think it had to be, it wasn't just a case of you've missed some school and you need to catch up a little bit. You're talking there's a significant gap between them and their peers, and so it was largely pupils. They were defining the thing as children who had difficulties with number concepts, magnitude, and applying strategies. And so they had a number of links. So they had like math learning disabilities, and at risk of a math learning disability, or pure numeracy. And those were the sort of labels used across the paper, which sort of shows that, your question about was it uniform across the studies? No, and I don't think we can expect that because everyone's got a different definition of disability. So I think, maybe it's sensible, but there are my interpretation of the word disability on a day-to-day level maybe doesn't line up with the way this has been applied here, because I would expect some sort of diagnosis or some sort of educational psychologist in sort of involvement in in the identification of global delay or perhaps some other sort of diagnosable learning difficulty and disability.
Okay, yeah, and I think it would be very hard to expect a standardization across all of those studies, but I'm getting the sense here that we're looking at students that are struggling to learn the maths perhaps more than you might ordinarily expect. So whatever that sort of fundamental reason for that is, these are perhaps the students that are being brought into this study and getting to sort of experience this intervention. So
if you're listening to this conversation and thinking about how to make mathematics richer, clearer, and more coherent for every child, then let me take a moment to tell you about something that's transforming classrooms around the world. The story of mathematics is not just another scheme. It's a complete, research-driven curriculum that reduces teacher workload, strengthens mathematical understanding, and gives schools a coherent journey from early counting through to pre-algebra and beyond. Every small step is intentional. Every representation has a purpose. Every episode is crafted so teachers know why they're teaching something, how to teach it, and what to look for as students develop real proficiency. Schools using the story of mathematics tell us the same thing. Lessons feel calmer, more focused, explanations feel sharper, and children make connections that previously took months to secure. Because the sequence isn't a patchwork of disjointed ideas, it's a narrative. Concepts are introduced exactly when they're needed, supported by manipulatives, worked examples, intelligent practice, and routines for reasoning and proof. And the best part of this is that teachers feel supported. They have the tools to be the most effective versions of themselves. Now, if your school is looking for a curriculum that actually reduces workload, increases confidence, and raises attainment, then now is the perfect time to take a look. Visit alta-education.com and book a conversation with the team, and you'll see very quickly why so many schools are making the switch. Now, back to the episode.
We've looked at sort of the definitions there. I suppose at a really high level, I'm interested in like what's the headline sort of result here that you'd want teachers to sort of to take away and to remember from this meta-analysis.
Yeah. So I mean, I reckon if this were if it was a decision made by a political party, then each of the different newspapers could take it and run in a different direction, because if you were looking at it on a very general level, it's generally quite positive. Because most of the studies have a positive effect. But four of the studies show a negative effect. So the effect size range from negative 1.11 to 2.96. And I think with each hundredth being significant, if I remember correctly. Um, so every change of 0.01 is something worth noting. So there's broad variation. So not all digital maths interventions are born equal, and they are reasonably likely. The heterogeneity is very high, so reasonably likely to have as much likely to have a negative impact as they are positive impact. Now, statistically speaking, that's not true because more of them had positive impact, but there's still a reasonable chance relative to many other things of having a negative impact. So the headline is generally positive, but there's a big variation. So not all of it. This doesn't always go well.
I mean, I'm sort of fascinated now to try and understand why that's the case. Is it that the different interventions, were so sort of different in their approaches that one works and one doesn't, or was it the context? Was it the way that the study was kind of conducted? Although I think the studies have passed a kind of threshold, so they should be robust. What is it in that that variation that we need to be really aware of, and we really need to think hard about in our classrooms?
Part of it actually seemed to be like your traditional, when you get small samples, you get large effect sizes. That there's that to be navigated. But I think it just speaks to the fact that you need to be very specific about what it is you're trying to address. Because there's a note here about things like arithmetic and factual fluency. If you're studying that, or if you've got an intervention to address that, it's much more likely to be successful or much more likely to be tested than mathematical problem solving or some level of reasoning. I mean, because we probably couldn't define either of those to a sufficient degree to then go on and study them. And so like something, and a digital math, I mean, I'm sure it's not sold as a digital math intervention, but something like times tables rock stars, really, really effective at helping pupils commit those key multiplication bonds to memory. And so that would be an example of a very specific case where the tool is right for the job. And but in some of these studies, the tool has not been right for the job. And so as teachers and as leaders, we need to think, okay, is what we're being sold, is it likely? Because the research would suggest that it's quite possible that it might have a negative effect. But I think it's on a case by case basis, and that's where they find. But in particular, arithmetic reasoning or arithmetic, factual fluency, is you're much more likely to be successful there. I think because it would make sense.
Yeah, that definitely does make sense to me. And so I suppose the next natural question is, a school or a school leader has sort of identified that there are some students that have got these gaps or these learning difficulties in maths, and they've got a little bit of money, they want to do something about it. Should they buy a digital tool?
I mean, I think that's the big takeaway from this paper is that a digital maths intervention can improve outcomes for students with maths difficulties. Um, but the results vary so much that careful selection, having tight routines and almost those transfer checks, you have to have those in place for it to be successful. So it's almost as much about the systems you have in place. And in the era of vibe coding, Neil Almond could probably knock you up a fact fluency thing, if you wanted. So I think it would have to be, beyond, like I said, you know, without becoming an advertisement for TTRS, it's a very good case of I don't want to say product market fit because that feels very businessy, but it's the right tool for the right job. It's the star-headed screwdriver when we've got a nail with it. We're not banging that nail with a hammer, are we? We're putting it in. I don't know. Terrible analogy, but you know what I mean. It's the right tool for the right job, and so whatever decision you're making, you had to think, what is the problem I have? What is the gap my children have? Would that be, would it be easily replaced with flashcards? Which is a low tech, but we know, a very effective way to commit things to memory, um, because we don't have a pot of money that's infinite, and we don't have the time. We don't have an infinite pot of time either. So we just need to be really careful. And really, what the research is suggesting is that it's a bit of a mixed bag, and actually not enough research has taken place, or not enough good quality research has taken place. And because I'm sure if it was a languages one, you'll have things like, well, Duolingo did their own research. That doesn't necessarily mean Duolingo, there's anything, it would make it um, into a collection of randomized control trials where it was possible to analyze them. And the same is true here. I'm sure lots of interventions have done their own quote unquote testing, but we need more testing, because there's so much money spent on this every year that actually we probably need, the biggest thing for researchers is we need to be testing these things more and more often, I think. If you're trying to keep up with artificial intelligence without losing your Sundays, subscribe to Teacher Prompts by Neil Alt. It's a weekly AI briefing for teachers, a quick scan of what matters, classroom ready prompt to try, and plain English explainers of the latest features. It's free, written with teachers in mind. Sign up at news.teacherprompts.ai.
So if we go back to the study then, and what it can tell us, I think earlier on you sort of suggested that things like sort of number facts or sort of arithmetic fluency seem to be the ones with the sort of more positive, higher effect sizes. Is that the case across the meta-analysis then, that arithmetic kind of shines? And where does reasoning, problem solving, and sort of other aspects of maths fit in there?
I mean, my takeaway was that it didn't really. It was just easier to test, it was easier to design applications or um, programs or interventions, should I say, use their terminology, the MDIs or DMIs. It was easier to design something that focused on fluency. So there was big overlap in the this exists and I can test this. Whereas, like I said, I'm not sure how really you would either teach reasoning digitally, or and test it in sort of like a randomized control setting. I suppose you could, but it just feels less tangible than facts, because we've seen lots of them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And then going back to something that we just touched upon earlier on, mobiles, sort of desktop computers. I don't know, maybe smart boards, tablets, whole class type stuff. When we're talking about a digital tool, is there a sort of vehicle that stands out as being a preferable choice?
I mean, according to these studies, mobiles, and I think they're very quick to say they're not saying there's a causal link, but there's definitely some sort of correlation going on here. Um, but mobile applications seem to be more impactful than laptop based. And I don't know whether or not that's just because laptops are quite cumbersome in today's modern age, and children have evolved past the need to use all of those keys, or even I've seen so many children swiping school computer screens that have never been touchscreen, you know, aimlessly. So yeah, so yes, that was a big takeaway. But like I said, they were very quick to say, we don't know if there's a reason behind this, but they said, probably more studies are needed. But it does put those interventions who are app based or mobile based at an advantage. Um, Speculation as to why is maybe, my gut says we've moved past that as we've moved past the laptop computer or just the personal computer in terms of utility. I don't know because I'm trying to think of like things from cognitive science, and reasons why this might be the case. And there's not really anything in tie to it. Maybe it's just they engage with it more because it's easier to do something. Like if we're thinking about fact fluency and we're thinking about every doing something every day, it's easier to get the phone out or the tablet out than it is to get the Spectrum 580 or whatever, and they used to roll out in the old days. I don't know. Any thoughts yourself?
I mean, I think we could sort of speculate here, but without doing some sort of studies, it would be hard. I get the feeling that a lot of these interventions might be kind of gamified in some sort of way, and I don't know whether the kind of modern take on a gaming kind of environment better suits a mobile rather than a sort of laptop or tablet. And there is a whole other thing that we could tap into here, which is just the idea of sort of equality in terms of access to digital tools, because we're still not at a stage where all students can access a digital device in school, or sometimes even struggling at home, and that's obviously a very important factor when we maybe consider, if schools are considering something like this, they need to make sure they've got the tech and that sort of equity of tech, so that all students can get those benefits if they indeed exist. So I don't know, but I think it's easy to say like young people spend a lot of time on their phones, so give them a sort of maths gamey type app thing, and they're going to take to it more readily than they might on an old ZX Spectrum.
That's what it was, the ZX Spectrum. And yeah, I mean, there's also yourself, like a leader might bring this stuff in and then it never gets used by anybody. And then so how can you test the efficacy of something where, um, and to be honest, I don't think many of these studies looked over a really extended period of time. I think maybe, there were quite a few of them were in the hours rather than the weeks and months. I like a good 2 month study at minimum. And so, there's that as well. But I think, yeah, so it's, because if they're doing them in like RCT, they're probably curtailing the behavior of those people who are taking part. Whereas, if in school, you live and die by the systems you put in place for your intervention, because if you've got a really effective system where something's happening every day, then it doesn't matter, you could have the worst intervention in the world. And if it's being consistently applied by high quality practitioners, then it's more likely to be successful than having the best intervention. But your teachers are letting it thingy on the gather dust on the shelf, or in the hard drive, so there's that element too. There are probably more questions than answers, but I suppose the fact that they could only find 24 reasonable papers and they only use 15 in the meta analysis suggests that actually that considering how much money is being spent on this, globally, we should probably be a bit more rigorous in our checking. So actually, for school teachers, and for school leaders, does your implementation, do your systems of implementation allow teachers to be successful, allow students to be successful? Because that'll probably it doesn't matter what you have in that instance, you can still be successful. And I think probably get the most out of your students.
You talking there, it's making me think about a few things that are obviously going to be important for schools. You said there, given the amount of money being spent, I mean, I imagine this is a huge market, because people globally are looking for, I suppose, an off-the-shelf solution that's going to fix all of the maths worries. And if you've got a clever marketing team, then you can probably pitch your app, or your digital intervention tool as the kind of silver bullet or the panacea. But I wonder how many of these apps sort of measure the success or measure their success or their impact within the app. You mentioned cognitive science earlier on, and obviously, I'm a big fan of how we learn and what really is going on when we learn. And do you think there's a danger that if schools don't have kind of external checking going on, that the I don't know, is emperor's new clothes the right phrase here? These apps are sort of, it's just recency, and students are just answering stuff because they've been working on that stuff, and there's not really the learning going on. How do we navigate that kind of tricky scenario?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that goes beyond the scope of this study. They didn't make any claims to that extent, but obviously, if you're not doing your own assessment, if whatever, that's the transferability. That's the, is the teacher noticing that this is having an impact in their in class? We know transfer is really difficult, but if you're learning very specific things, and those very specific things are supposed to help you with, we know in maths, for instance, certain pieces of knowledge, certain pieces of information can unlock much more of the later puzzle, and then it makes sense that you would be checking for understanding all the time as part of your teaching and learning. So yeah, so I think that just that's a natural. If you're an effective school, if teaching and learning is effective, then the application and the digital intervention feeds your teaching and learning. It supplements your teaching and learning. It doesn't replace it. We're not talking about an alpha school model like Neil and James would be talking about. Where it's doing all of the teaching. This is supplementary. And I've just Googled, and it says 19.33 billion in 2024 was the size of the STEM digital education market. So that isn't, and to have 24 studies in that ballpark is that's wild. That's one study, almost $1 billion per study. Oh dear.
That is quite sort of incredible when you look at it in that sort of from that angle, to think about what a big industry it is. It just goes again to say how teachers and school leaders and just the education section or sector as a whole needs to be critical. We've I said at the beginning, we've got finite budget and finite time. We've got to do the right things with those precious resources. But it doesn't mean that this is not the right thing to do for our students. But if a teacher is bringing in some sort of app or digital intervention tool, and you were to say to them, well, this is what it should look like in your class, across a week, let's say, how frequently do you think they should be used? What sort of guidelines and restrictions should teachers be sort of putting in place with the students? And I suppose, what are some of the mistakes that schools might make when they adopt a digital intervention?
Yeah, an interesting one. Um, I think mistakes wise, it's just the inverse of those of effective implementation. It's the buying in. There's no connection between the person who made the decision and the person whose job it will be to implement, and there's no oversight of how that implementation is going. Like any sort of effective I think it's got to be little and often. You're not doing 2.5 hours one day a month. You're doing 2 minutes a day for that month. And I think, so duration wise, that's what I would go for. But I think, where things go wrong is that disconnect, because if a teacher understands why they're doing something or why a student's expected to do something, or they can see the value of something, or even if it's just made explicit that this is something that happens here, then then you've got a chance of that being successful, because if there's only one teacher, say Key Stage 2, and you've got year 3, 4, 5, and 6, and say the year 4 teacher's doing something every day, but year 3 and year 5 aren't. Well, as that pupil goes through 3, 4, 5, and 6, it's the equivalent of chunking all your, or like massing all your practice into one year. Whereas if it's spread out over those 4 years, much more likely to make a difference to the student, because as we've talked about before, the number of students who are leaving primary school working below the expected standard and then are still working below that same expected standard when it comes to foundation GCSE or whatever the tier system might be, is quite staggering. So, I think the two feed each other, don't they? There's got to be a coherent plan for how things are going to happen. There's going to be clear expectations of when things happen, and it's probably going to be little and often, and utilizing the resources we have at best. Because I'm thinking about, like, if it's digital, you're going to need devices, and sometimes a school will only have enough for half a class and devices. So that's going to need a timetable. You're going to have to think about your setting. Whoever's making this decision, or I'm bringing this intervention in, I'm making this decision. Here are the ways that we can be successful. Here are the systems we need in place, or the processes we need in place. So we need someone to bring the trolley round with the devices in the morning. We need someone to make sure that it's charging before it goes to the next person. There are lots of really small things that lead to success, because just like with exercise, if you put barriers in front of teachers, well, they're just going to go, well, I'm not doing that. I speak as someone who would do that regularly and say, if someone made it something more difficult than it needed to be, well, it's not getting done because my day is already busy enough. I'm not, I've already spent my lunchtime resource in the afternoon, and I've been here since 7 o'clock in the morning. If you're going to put barriers in my way, well, that's not going to be something I'm going to bend over backwards to get done. Whereas if you make things smooth and you make systems, well, then maybe that speaks to the kind of person that I am. And with those systems are in place, then I'll follow the systems and we'll make sure things are done. So a long way of saying, the processes we put in place, the things we put in place to make sure things are successful by the decision maker, that's the key, no matter what resource you have, I think.
To some extent, the job of a school leader and decision maker is to ensure that the road ahead is clear, or as clear as possible, for the teachers to do their thing. And you're absolutely right. Uncharged devices or broken tech is enough to put some teachers off because of that precious time resource. They'll do something different. So this is really interesting now, because we've obviously gone from quite a high level talking about the study and gone into a little bit more detail about the medium and the different types of devices and even different types of sort of interventions. And there we're talking now about a kind of school leadership approach. But what about if we get right into the classroom? So I've been given access to some sort of digital intervention tool, and I've got the students are on it. The devices are all charged and everyone's working away, and like they're all doing really, really well in the app. Like it's gold medals or 5 stars or whatever the reward system is. And I get to the end of the day and I think this is super. And then the next day I give them a sort of paper-based version of the same, and they really struggle. Like, is that a possible scenario? What could be going on there? How do we deal with that?
That's the issue of transfer, isn't it? And it's probably the idea that salient ideas, or when things are too salient, they're especially difficult to transfer. So if you've gamified your intervention in such a way that it looks like it's only this specific situation where something works, then you may have an issue on your hands. Because what you want is, you want to be able to say, okay, in all of these situations, this maths applies. But if they think it's only when the bumblebees are together, or only when the ladybirds are there, and that's why in year 2 you always find teachers going from, oh, they can do it with the manipulatives, but they can't do it with their books. It's that kind of idea. They need to see the connection between what they're doing in class and what they've done. Because I've seen plenty of teachers and plenty of students say, oh, I didn't realize that's what that was for. And then see, oh, how those two were connected. So the kid could do it 100% in the app, but 0% in the written form. It's showing them the bridge, showing them the connection, and maybe having the app on your screen when you're doing the instruction that matches up with it. That kind of thing. I don't know. But always talking to them about what they're doing in the app, how they're doing in the intervention feeds into what they're doing in class. Because sometimes kids see, like, have phonics interventions and only see that as that's the thing we do outside the classroom, when really they should be doing that when they're reading in the classroom as well. That's what I think.
And I think that it is really good advice, isn't it? Because repeated practice of a very sort of narrow focused activity does not necessarily mean that students are going to realise that tomorrow's question in a different context or setting is the same maths at the core. And I suppose that kind of connects to that concrete pictorial abstract progression that we sometimes talk about, where we need to make sure that the models, the representations, and even the language that's being used is coherent all the way through that cycle. So yeah, I can see this digital app, but it's going to have a variety of representations to allow students to sort of generalize, and we're going to have to make sure that language that we're using as an instructor, as a teacher, and the language that they're maybe meeting through these digital tools is in some way kind of aligned, so that they can sort of segue from that digital intervention tool and sort of straight into the class. That's definitely food for thought, isn't it? That's really
Well,
interesting.
I mean that's probably why that sort of reasoning or sense making didn't feature in the studies that much, because as you're describing it, I mean, how many layers to that are there, and what are the
It's
chances of someone with that expertise existing?
it's so hard, isn't it? I think throughout my career, you know, parents' evenings have often been peppered with, how do I help them improve their problem solving? It's problem solving that they can't do. And if somebody knew a clean cut answer to that, they'd have published a resource and they'd be sitting pretty right now. It is a challenge, and I think these digital tools may well help support that, because they're building up the fluency, they're building up the knowledge, but along with that needs to come the reasoning, so they can kind of bounce off each other and lead to successful problem solving.
If you enjoy the conversations on this podcast, you'll love Hey What You Reading For, our weekly newsletter where we explore the ideas shaping education right now. Each edition brings you research, reflection, and recommendations to challenge your thinking and sharpen your practice. You can sign up for free at thinkingdeeply.info.
I think we're nearing the end of this conversation. I suppose something that we've just about touched on here, but it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on is, what is next for the research community? What is the next question the research community needs to answer, so that teachers have that higher level of clarity, and they're not forced to guess, essentially.
I mean, I think the next question that needs to be answered sort of, it's been evident in your line of questioning, because we had a lot of questions we could have asked about this paper, but you sort of refined them into your sort of your almost like a train of thought or a line of questioning. And it's what specific design features and implementation conditions produce reliable transfer. You know, for which student profiles is that true? Um, and can we then reduce the heterogeneity in the effects? So essentially, it's what design features and conditions produce reliable transfer, and for which student profile. So almost being really specific, being more specific than just saying, oh, pupils with MLD, and being really specific. So it means more studies and it means more randomized control trials. But I think that's the big picture. And the next question answer is, okay, let's be really specific about what works when, particularly in terms of transfer.
Okay, so that is Kieran Mackle's challenge to the research community. That's what's next on their to-do list. But what about finishing off back in the classroom here? If you were to give one kind of underlying key principle to teachers to keep in mind when they're using technology for struggling learners, what would that key principle be?
If it doesn't transfer and you don't see improved explanation or improved sort of work from the pupils, almost the evidence of learning months later, then it's not learning that's occurred. It's just performance in that environment. And so just like we're always mindful of the distinction between performance and learning in a classroom, when it's digital, when it's analog, if it doesn't transfer, really, is it good use of our time? Because being able to do it in one particular environment isn't useful for that student at all, because that's not the way their life is going to be played out.
I think that is a solid piece of advice to conclude this conversation with. Thanks, Kieran. You've clearly spent a bit of time getting immersed in that meta study, and I've certainly found it really interesting and helpful to talk it through with you this afternoon.
No, my pleasure. Yeah, it was interesting, and like I said, I was hoping for more answers, but I just got more. more questions. Yeah, so thank you very much for taking the reins. And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.